My name is Federica Genovese. I'm a political scientist. I specialize in the politics of crisis and specifically climate change. Welcome to my exp. Broadly speaking, when we think about climate policies, we either think of what we call climate mitigation policies, which are essentially policies that try to reduce carbon emissions or to do what we usually call decarbonization. Or otherwise, climate policies can look more like adaptation policies, which is essentially a way to talk about the management of the consequences of the crisis that climate change magnifies. There's a lot of debate on climate change policies. In fact, there's probably more debate about how climate policies should be designed than on whether climate change is happening or not. And countries disagree across themselves and within themselves on how best to design them. Mitigation policies and adaptation policies, from a technical standpoint, come together. They shouldn't be thought about as two opposite goals of climate action. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for many years, in fact decades, has suggested that those two things need to be done at the same time, simultaneously, because on the one hand, we do need to reduce emissions and we need to think about how the new economy of the future will look like that will generate fewer emissions, while also adapting to the fact that at this point we have accumulated a lot of emissions that are changing and in fact have changed the climate, so we need to adapt. That said, and this is where the politics comes in, a lot of the political debate around climate policy often juxtaposes mitigation policies and adaptation policies, almost as if they are two oppositional goals of climate policy. And a lot of different ideological factions have actually sort of sided with either mitigation policy and adaptation policy. Carbon taxes have been described, especially by environmental economists, as the most effective type of carbon policy. And to some extent they are, because they're the most obvious type of climate policy. It's usually a pretty straightforward one-figure type of policy. It's not very hard to design. It can be hard to monitor, but generally speaking, especially in states that have enough fiscal capacity, they can be very effective. The problem is that not a lot of people like taxation, and that the politics of taxation, and specifically carbon taxation, can be incredibly hard to digest. Cap and trade, on the other hand, because it's more flexible, it doesn't generate the same type of toxic policies that carbon taxes tend to generate. Cap and trade and carbon markets are much more about training the actors that get regulated, like polluting firms, to think about the externalities that their production causes, like emissions. The problem with cap and trade, though, is that often it's only meant to start with a low bar, so with cheap allowances and with low levels of carbon to regulate, so that eventually across time they can go up. And this going up is usually what firms don't like. So even if it's a more flexible mechanism, cap and trade also can be politically toxic and also can be captured by interests that don't like them. Adaptation policies have historically been the Cinderella of climate policy, partly because for a very long time adaptation seemed to be an issue only for the most vulnerable countries, partly because adaptation politics are actually harder than mitigation politics. Adaptation policies are essentially those policies that try to manage the fact that the climate crisis is here to stay, and that we need to deal with an increased frequency in natural disasters and extreme weather events and increasing temperatures. Examples of adaptation policy at the local level would be, for example, infrastructure investment. In the United Kingdom, for example, a lot of adaptation policy has to do with flood prevention or prevention of further sea level rise and coastal corrosion. Adaptation policy is very expensive. It doesn't mean that it's not effective. In fact, you'd rather live in a world in which there is adaptation investments and there are strong adaptation policies instead of not. But it's actually, relatively speaking, much more expensive than mitigation policy. And again, adaptation politics can be equal, if not more toxic than mitigation politics, because we're essentially all losers of climate change, and exposing the fact that we have not invested enough in adaptation means that we are all at the risk of suffering from climate change. Adaptation policies can be preventive, so they can try to build infrastructure, for example, in prevention of the amount of sea level rise that we expect in 10, 20, and 30 years from now. Can also be reactive. The building of housing in the follow-up of a major flood is a reaction to the fact that probably a lot of homes were lost by previous floods. There hasn't been enough investment at the global level or at the local level on adaptation to make adaptation policy only preventive at this point. There is a lot of reactive adaptation policy that is happening. Some of which will end up also being about managing the potential refugees of climate disasters, or the potential dislocated households that will suffer from climate events. So adaptation politics is essentially the residual of mitigation policy, to the extent that it's dealing with all the consequences that climate change will throw at the earth and global society as we know it, that doesn't entail just decarbonization. Essentially, thinking about a just energy transition or a just climate transition forces us to think about the social, community level dynamics that need to be taken seriously if we want democratic, bottom-up, public buy-in in the climate transition. The key word in just transition is obviously just. In other words, there is a lot of emphasis on the fact that there needs to be an explicit justice embedded in the way in which we design mitigation or adaptation policies. It's essentially, a beg for thinking about the social human dimension that otherwise has been dismissed for many years of climate policy that was way too technocratic, way too top-down, way more legalistically thought than sociologically thought.